So let me go to that now. We like the first thing in terms of a question. Would that help?
Sure.
Excuse me. In recent weeks, there have been reports that has been some fragmentation in the solidarity or the unity within the Palestinian community in the occupied territories. Particularly, there have been reports of a Islamic fundamentalist movement gaining some upsurgence, particularly in Gaza, but not simply in Gaza, and that they have begun issuing directives in contradiction or in separate from, in any case, the stated goals of the unified leadership of the uprising. Can you talk about the degree to which those splits are tangible, the degree to which they've been manipulated, and I guess more broadly, the kinds of the vulnerability of the uprising to attempts at manipulation of it?
You know, interestingly enough, Elizabeth, it has been the tradition, I think, that almost every event that takes place in the third world in general gets so manipulated in the West, in the United States in particular, to the point that the question at hand is never really confronted directly. Let me clarify this by going back a little bit to the beginning of the uprising, Palestinian uprising, in November and December of last year, 87. I'm sure almost everybody recalls, or should recall, that when the uprising started on December 9th, the media coverage of it here in the United States was that this is basically a resurgence of Islamic fundamentalism in Palestine, and basically that the ones who are quote-unquote causing the trouble for Israel are Muslim fundamentalists. And this kind of coverage took place really for a few weeks. Well, this falsification of facts, popular facts basically reflecting popular sentiments in Palestine, basically faded because these kind of, I think, misconceptions proved to be inaccurate. So it was realized then that it's not a question of Islamic fundamentalism in Palestine, but it's basically a question of Israeli fundamentalism and clear response to that fundamentalism by the whole Palestinian community. Almost, I mean, every village, every camp, every city in Palestine lost martyrs, had lots of people wounded. In other words, has been affected directly by Israeli brutality, and henceforth every spot in Palestine was part of the uprising or had something to do with the uprising. Now, if we put that in a kind of context and look at the overflowing, if you will, attempt at manipulating events in Palestine, we find that toward the middle of this year, the spring, there have been several reports coming out from several American newspapers and basically sent from correspondents in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv, saying that the unified leadership, the underground unified leadership of the uprising is basically splitting, in the sense that there have been several leaflets and basically contradictory leaflets coming at the same time. Very soon, I think, these kind of rumors faded as well, because you know, the Israeli intelligence services tried to issue some leaflets on its own, basically under some kind of, you know, a name, titled one faction or another, one political current or another, saying that, you know, trying to tell the Palestinians to do something other than what the unified leadership is doing. But this didn't work. Now I think the attempt is taking place again by the United States as well as by the Israeli intelligence services trying to present some kind of split in the Palestinian community in Palestine. And, you know, I think it's basically kind of a wishful sort of thinking. That is not to say that there is no, you know, debate. It's absolutely natural to have agreements and disagreements in any community. But it's why is it so focused upon that much when it comes to Palestine, while there is no discussion over that, let's say, in other places in the United States. I mean, it's almost the question of individualism. If you have 240 million Americans, you may end up with 240 million, some kind of individual tastes, of life. So I think it's basically wishful thinking that there has been a split, that it's basically Islamic fundamentalism. Well, there could be, as I said, disagreement of opinion, but the bottom line that the Palestinian community is very cohesive, especially in the occupied territories. The solidarity among Palestinians is, to be quite frank, historic. For a whole year, nobody is has been able to work. Everybody is basically supporting everybody else. And we didn't hear about starvation in Palestine. We hear about houses being demolished, but we don't hear about starvation. We hear about people being killed, wounded, concentrated from all walks of life, Muslims, Christians. So really, as I said, it's the media does falsify and basically tries to create some kind of images in the minds of people here to distract them from the factual situation in Palestine.
Okay, excuse me. In the earlier instance that you were talking about, when the U.S. press reported that there were these falling outs or disagreements about policy, a break in solidarity. I do remember that the dummy leaflets, the phony leaflets, were discovered, and there has been some acknowledgement from within the Israeli community that they were manufactured. That's also the same period in time, I think, at which it was discovered that the Shin Bet, the secret police, were putting press stickers on their cars and were pretending to be members of the press in order to identify Palestinians. So that kind of manipulation, I know there's a record of that. At the same time, let me be a little clearer about this. One of the things that has always characterized the Palestinian movement, I think, internationally, and particularly in terms of Middle Eastern politics, is that it has consistently been a secular movement. At the same time, there has been repeatedly or recurrently indications that there is there are not one but now two movements which are religiously based, and the first is some local version of Islamic Jihad that we've heard reference to. The second is one that has more recently emerged, and that's something referred to as Hamas. I'm not sure that that's the correct pronunciation. But what I'd like you to do is, in terms of recent events, for example, the deaths of, or the political assassination, seemingly, of people who've been identified as collaborators with the Israeli regime. Are those things seemingly, what's the word that I want to use here? Are those actions of provocateurs, do you think? Or is it simply another direction that the movement's going in? And finally, the two groups, religiously based groups that I've mentioned, is there any substance to them at all?
Well, as to the last part of the question, in other words, as to the Islamic groups mentioned, this is really kind of a tricky, issue, in the sense that, if we look at Lebanon, several times, or we hear that, about several organizations adopting the name of Islam one way or another, basically regarding the taking of hostages, regarding taking, doing other, actions and so on and so forth. And really, it's difficult to know exactly what's going on. I think the degree of frustration in the Palestinian society, in the related Arab societies, especially in Lebanon, has been so intense. And whether it's Islamic, or otherwise Christian or whatever it is, it found some kind of expression through some kind of underground, operations, whether through, an attack on Israeli soldiers, the taking of hostages perhaps, although this is a little bit more controversial question, or through demonstrations in the occupied territories, on occupied Palestine. So really, to label a certain action kind of so religiously, I think is absolutely missing the point. Although it is undeniable that there is, an Islamic movement, let's say, among the Palestinians. But really, it's exactly equivalent, to saying that there is, let's say, a Christian tendency, let's say, in the American society, a Jewish tendency in the Israeli society, and so on and so forth. And just placing the focus on the question of religion or one's religious identification, while isolating other variables, is really doesn't really lead to a comprehensive analysis, to be quite frank. And the media here has been playing this chord, but it's I'm not exactly sure where it's going to lead. As to the second part of the question regarding the assassination, of collaborators, I think this is another forceful expression by the Palestinian society that, first we exhausted all legal channels to achieve our goals, to gain our rights, to retrieve our rights, and this didn't work, especially in the Israeli legal system, which is to them is illegal. We also exhausted the legal mechanism internationally, and this didn't work. Now, if you were in a situation where you had a government, somebody who is a spy is obviously going to be charged with treason, and there has to be some kind of legal recourse to basically making sure that this person is brought under the umbrella of the law. If you are in a situation where you have no government and where you are prevented from establishing a government, from establishing any sort of even local governmental apparatus, a municipality or whatever union, then you definitely have to resort to other methods of making sure that these spies, these collaborators, basically do not increase in number and in volume. And I think it's a very clear message to the Israelis that no matter how harsh they try to become and to be, it simply doesn't work, because the will of the people basically takes precedence and takes over all other barriers that the Israelis are establishing. So it's not a new phenomenon, but its intensity is definitely new. Since the uprising, there have been several collaborators being assassinated, being killed. So this is a clear message, I believe, to the Israelis as well as to their collaborators in the Israeli society, in the Palestinian society.
Okay. We'll now continue with the interview with Hisham Ahmed, and we take up again with the question of the political situation among the Palestinian community outside the occupied territories as well as within. Let's change direction now, and we'll go only a slight change of direction. Ever since the Intifada began in December, and mid-December of '87. By the time it had not simply become another brief incident in a history of a whole bunch of them. I think there were something like three 500 incidents during the previous year, which were not sustained. They were all signs of resistance, but there wasn't the kind of sustained resistance to Israeli occupation that began in December. In any case, from that point, when it became clear that it wasn't all going to quickly fade away, until the present, the Palestinian Liberation Organization internationally seems to have been lagging behind the movement. The Israelis have tried to argue that the PLO has been behind all of this to begin with, and I think they're using behind in a very different sense than I mean it. It's clearly not been instigated externally, but it's something that seems to have emerged and been sustained internally now with external support. But it seems that the PLO has not been able either to catch up or to, by many accounts, to take advantage of a heightened international sympathy and interest in the problem of the Palestinians. So my question is, how would you assess the performance of the PLO? What are the kinds of hindrances to their taking some effective action? And what do you see them doing in the sort of short-term future?
This is a very profound and very important question indeed. To go back in history a little bit again, when the uprising started, it was the coverage, in the press here was as if it was some kind of, a mechanical instigation. Somebody from outside just pressed the remote control. The PLO pressed the remote control, and just people went into the street in the occupied territories. That's the kind of image, really, the media here presented, and of course that's the kind of image that the Israelis wanted the media here to present. And they did it for a long time, and obviously this, this argument was nonsensical to start with. We all know that Abu Jihad was murdered, in Tunis, basically in an attempt to first to quell the Palestinians in the occupied territories psychologically. In other words, here is the second man in the PLO, and he is basically the military person in the PLO, and we are managing as Israelis to get to his home and basically murder him. So it was an attempt really to quell the Palestinians psychologically. Secondly, of course, it was an attempt to try to demolish the material, to weaken the material strength in the PLO from a military standpoint. Now, in all these complexities, I think there are fundamental questions facing the Palestinian movement inside and outside occupied Palestine, but I think you are right saying that there has been a lot of lagging behind on the part of the movement outside to several reasons. Indeed, some of them are unavoidable, but some I believe could have been worked on a little bit better. Now, let me venture some kind of a brief explanation. I think the focus outside has been thus far on somehow presenting the Palestinian movement, the PLO, as a reasonable organization and making that presentation to the United States in particular. In other words, coming up with every gesture, all sorts of declaration. Bassam Abu Sharif's statement in June of this year, Bassam Abu Sharif being one of Arafat's aides, that the PLO basically explicitly declares its recognition of Israel's right to exist, its acceptance of Resolution 242, if that was in the context of other UN resolutions, and all sorts of other things in the list, basically trying to present to the United States that we are reasonable. And I believe that this kind of strategy is unworkable. It doesn't work. Can never convince a colonial establishment such as that of Israel that Palestinians have a just cause. Well, they do that. They do know that, and they do basically suppress the Palestinians premeditatedly. The United States does know. It has one of the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus perhaps in the world, does know that the Palestinians are suppressed and oppressed, and it willingly supports Israel militarily, economically, and I think there has to be a shift in strategy, and it's a very critical turning point. As to where the focus should be, this is a little bit difficult to go in, in this context, but the question of declaring a Palestinian state, an independent Palestinian state, should be considered and considered seriously, but not as a symbolic gesture. After all, there was a declaration of statehood in 1948 by Hajj Amin Husseini, who was the Mufti of Jerusalem, head of the Higher Arab Committee, and he declared from his base in Gaza the establishment of a Palestinian state, a government there actually. And this didn't work. Why? Because the focus was on symbolic gestures. And what the Palestinians now need to do is basically build their own strength. They need to build interior strength to mobilize all the sources they have on the domestic level, despite the, if you will, fragmentation due to the diaspora, the regional Arab level, as well as on the international level. And basically, I think they have to impose some kind of a solution on the Israelis and on the United States. In other words, the United States and the Israelis have to basically come to terms with Palestinian rights from Palestinian strength. Otherwise, I believe the prospects are weak. And this might sound unconvincing to many, and even to some Palestinians. I can understand that and empathize with that kind of thinking, but to be quite frank, just to adopt some kind of a Republican slogan these days, I think Palestinians have to have peace through strength. This is what Bush says, and sometimes you get to have the wisdom from the mouth of the devil. And that's what the Palestinians have to do now, I think, these days. Now, the PNC, the Palestine National Council, is going to be held the end of this month. And I'm not exactly sure why the timing has been chosen to be at the end of the month, but I think there are absolutely underlying issues that have to be confronted there.
For example?
How to build some kind of a parity of achievement between the PLO, the political structure of the Palestinian movement outside with that of what's taking place inside Palestine. In other words, really, the movement outside, I believe, has tremendously lagged behind. It's true, there is moral support and so on and so forth. But that doesn't really answer the pressing questions that require some kind of, I believe, a serious, way of response. Another question, of course, is the question of a Palestinian state. Mm-hmm. Whether to declare a Palestinian state or not, and I think there ought to be a declaration of independent Palestinian state, but then how to reinforce, how to put that state into effect. That's more important than just declaring a Palestinian state. Well, everybody can declare a Palestinian state, and a unilateral declaration of a Palestinian state doesn't really mean much if it was not basically put into effect with a strong mechanism of making sure that this declaration is not going to be basically, some kind of rhetoric.
So let me talk about the kinds of things that are being bandied about at the moment. One of which is, two things. First, you commented about not doing things essentially with an eye to whether or not they're going to please either the U.S. or Israel. And I know there had been reports coming out of the Middle East that there were pressures being brought to bear on the PLO from unnamed sources, one of whom seems at least to have been Mubarak of Egypt, to postpone any declaration until after the U.S. and the Israeli elections. I don't know why he was giving this advice. Seems like tremendously bad advice to me. But in any case, that's the kind of thing that you're saying makes no sense, I presume, that to gear one's policies to parties who have essentially no interest in your achieving anything that you're after. Is that fair enough?
That's indeed very fair.
Okay.
That's very well phrased. Indeed, this question of, as I said, when to hold the PNC, when to issue the declaration, if to do that at all, this kind of advice that has been given all along by the quote-unquote concerned Arab leaders has been more harmful, perhaps, than even some military moves. The Arab governments don't have an interest in the establishment of a Palestinian state, and they will do everything possible basically to weaken that prospect. And add to that, I'm not exactly sure why the Palestinian movement has to wait until the American Israeli election. I mean, it doesn't really make the least of logic, even to subject it to analysis, to be quite frank. It doesn't make any sense. I'm not exactly sure why. I'm not exactly sure what's the reasoning and the expectation behind it. I mean, if there was an expectation, that the labor would come to, would hold, would establish the government in Israel. Well, first of all, this is not likely because the Israeli public, I think, is being more radicalized now, more than ever. But even assuming that the labor, just a hypothetical assumption, that the labor will come to, establish the government, well, who was behind the establishment of Israel to start with? It was the labor. Who engaged in the 1967 war? It was the labor. So, the labor is more pragmatic, more charismatic, has a more charismatic leadership to present itself to the outside world. It's more reasonable, it's more willing, to come to terms with the Palestinians. But, despite its concern, it's not going to basically negotiate with the PLO, because the PLO is a terrorist organization. Always this kind of, propaganda, this kind of falsification. And, the Palestinian leadership has to understand that. And the first question that has to be raised, to whom should the finger of terrorism be pointed? I mean, the talk about the Nuremberg trials, about, war crimes. Well, my goodness, what is Israel doing these days? I mean, all kinds of, war crimes. Palestinians are being buried alive. What more can you do to commit a war crime? As to Nuremberg trials, I don't think we can have them by trying just to be sound reasonable, for the instigators of these crimes, for the committers of these crimes. So I think the shift in direction has to be clear and explicit. It's not a call for more radicalization of the Palestinian movement, but I think there has to be some kind of parallel between what's taking place inside and outside Palestine, that's for sure.
There have been reports that essentially all the major parties, and I'm referring to what are normally called factions in the U.S. media, but Fatah, the PFLP, the DFLP, have all agreed to a declaration of statehood. What seems to have been a bigger stumbling block, however, is how to proceed afterwards, whether or not to declare a government in exile or an interim government. And are these also the kinds of issues that you're suggesting they need to address at the PNC, and in what manner?
Now there are three different scenarios as I can envisage, really. Regarding the establishment or the declaration of Palestinian state. One is basically to declare the establishment of a government in exile, which would replace the PLO. And that government, this government in exile will basically has its, legislative apparatus and so on and so forth, and will be basically representative of the Palestinians, more or less similar to what the PLO did. The major difference is that it will not have the Palestine National Charter as the governing mechanism in its organization, but rather it will have a new constitution. Now, what will that do is basically shred the Palestinian national covenant, and that is an achievement for what Israeli and Zionist officials have been trying to do all along. That's one scenario, and it seems unlikely, fortunately. The second scenario is to declare the establishment of a government in exile while keeping the PLO as an organization. The PLO will maintain its activities, political and otherwise, and the government in exile will have really a less revolutionary structure, one geared more toward governmental functions, to more directly look after Palestinian interests inside and outside the occupied territories. What you may have involved there is some kind of a Palestinian passport. So you really would start looking at it from kind of a legal, perspective, a mechanical legal perspective, who is a Palestinian citizen, and so on and so forth. And that was the second scenario, to declare the establishment of a government in exile. Now, the third scenario, which is, I think, the most practical and the most realistic, is to declare the establishment of a provisional government, and that declaration comes from Palestine itself. The declaration comes from Palestine. The members of the government will basically consist of Palestinians from inside as well as from outside through some sort of organization, and I think there has to be some kind of planning for that. That government could be established. Now, it's not going to carry out it's not going to carry on its function so easily, because of course it's going to be similar to the function of the unified leadership these days. But I think Palestinians could manage that, and they have managed that, throughout the last 10 months or so. Now, what that means is that, the nucleus for the establishment of the Palestinian state will basically, take place, and there has to be a consolidation of that state building block within, and has to be perpetuated and reinforced from outside by the PLO itself. Now, again, that means an entire shift in strategy and in outlook at what are the functions, really, what the functions of the PLO are, and what its focus should be, from now on. So these are complicated scenarios, but I think that the last scenario is the one that will basically take place in the, hopefully, in the near future. I think that's the most practical and the most viable one.
The final segment of the interview with Hisham Ahmed. Okay, Hisham, the third area that we wanted to cover today was some of the situation inside of the occupied territories and in Israel right now. What do you see as both the current situation and what's likely to evolve in the near future and in longer terms as well?
Well, when the uprising started, we kept hearing from the Israeli defense minister, from Yitzhak Rabin, that the uprising is going down and everybody is quiet now, everything is in order. And this was, said over and over and over and over, and the stone kept, became stronger and stronger. Basically, the Palestinians, I believe, what they did, most outstanding achievement in the uprising is that they really I believe, destroyed the myth that the Israeli military strength is unchallengeable. Arab armies were not able to confront the Israeli army because of its unchallengeable, unequaled, asymmetrical strength. I think what the Palestinians did with the stone is basically proved the falsity of this kind of assumption, and that it was basically just a Western quote-unquote scholarly assumption, not based on factual premises, but basically based on some kind of modeling, and doesn't really relate to facts. Now, the uprising is becoming more intense because the Israeli brutality is becoming also more intensified. Every school is closed by the Israeli authorities. Every Palestinian school is closed. Every university is closed. Even hospitals are closed. We're talking about tens of thousands of Palestinians being jailed and concentrated basically in some form of camps in the desert, in the Negev desert. We're talking about thousands of Palestinians being wounded, about hundreds being killed in the uprising. We're talking about hospitals being prevented from taking the wounded in for treatment. We're talking about all sorts of harassments. You cannot plant, things in your garden freely. The trees are uprooted. Almost everything is basically kind of in a chaotic situation. Houses are demolished. Now, in light of all of this, it's unimaginable to think that the uprising is going to be basically, quieted, so to speak, because the harder you press on people, I think the more likely that they're going to revolt, and that's what the Palestinians are doing now. As to what or to where this is going to lead, I think it's the clear face of Israel is being exposed. To start with, this myth about Israeli democracy, I believe, has been if you will, proven to be false, or to be actually a myth, actually. The solidarity among the Palestinians is stronger than ever, but I believe that the uprising will continue up to a point, and there is not going to be an end to the uprising. I believe that what there will be is a shift of tactics among the Palestinians. In other words, to employ more sophisticated methods to force some kind of a solution on the on the Israeli leadership. And if you look at the Israeli army now, it's basically becoming an army of an army of occupation, military occupation, oppressors. That's what they are busy doing nowadays. And this is definitely, of course, damaging the morale of the Israeli army. And you may expect internal chaos in Israel due to this to the emergence of this phenomenon. But again, the uprising is definitely enduring, and Palestinians are determined because simply they have no other place to go. They have no other choice to start with. They witnessed, they observed Palestinians in the years before, especially in the camps in Lebanon, basically reduced to eating dogs and cats and rats and the like. And of course, that was one of the other driving forces for the Palestinian uprising. So really, there is no other alternative but to be determined and to force a solution on the Israelis. And the Israelis will suffer from that. There's no question about it. So far, most of the suffering has been basically placed on the Palestinians, but that's not really the end of the story. I believe that's only the beginning of an era. And in the context of that, I think the United States will be also influenced so greatly by its unconditional backing of Israel